Whenever you guys are ready, we are recording.
All right, great. Well, hey, Derek Thompson, thank you so much for joining us today. I got to say, you're one of my favorite writers, and I've been like looking forward to this like more than you even know. Uh,
I really
for,
appreciate that. Thank you.
for everybody tuning in, I want to thank the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists for putting this on, organizing it. And we're going to be talking with Derek Thompson. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's also a founder of an amazing podcast called Crazy Genius, which I'm a huge fan of. And he's also author of the book Hitmakers. So Derek, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So first things first, writing you cover right now, is it economics and culture at The Atlantic? You write about like a wide range of topics. And I was wondering how long you've been there and how did you even get there?
Yes, I've been at The Atlantic for about 12 years. I got to The Atlantic after graduating from Northwestern. I was at journalism school at Northwestern at Medill. As a side point, I don't actually think necessarily that today, the best way to journalism is to go to journalism school, but I just really knew that at 18, I wanted to be a journalist. And so I figured, you got to major in something. So I might as well major in the thing that I'm pretty sure I want to do. So I majored in journalism at Northwestern, with a little sort of stuff on the side on politics. I did a lot of theater at Northwestern, a lot of a cappella. And I like to think that to a certain extent, my theater experience prepared me for the fact that a lot of modern journalism, both on Twitter, but also on radio and TV is semi-theatrical. But went to The Atlantic after I graduated and have been there for 12 and a half years. Started off as an intern, became an online staff writer, then became the business editor. Then I decided I didn't really want to edit people anymore. So I fired myself back to being a staff writer. And now I remain a staff writer. So I've been up and down the corporate ladder, but always on the same corporate ladder.
That's great. And one thing that's always what struck me about your writing is I love the topics that you cover. It's like the stuff that I'm interested in. Like sometimes it's like really random. And I was wondering, I don't know, could you talk a little bit about how you develop your story ideas? Are a lot of them assigned, or do you find all your story ideas?
I would say very few of my story ideas are assigned. Some of them are, but most of the ideas come from my interests, my curiosities. And one of the things that I remember really trying to purposefully teach myself as I was getting started as a staff writer at The Atlantic was how to pay attention to that inner voice in my head, and I think the inner voice in everybody's head, that says, I don't know about that, or that's kind of interesting. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Those like invisible, very quiet, almost whispered curiosities that people feel, I think are the greatest assignment editors in the world. And so I just basically tried to attune myself to my own ignorance and pay attention to what is it that I don't know and want to figure out more about. So, for example, I'll take a bunch of articles I've just written. The very last article that I wrote was on synthetic mRNA technology, the technology behind the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines. I mean, look, this is the fastest vaccine development in human history, and it's a technology that I had never heard of like 6 months ago. So I really wanted to figure out, why did it have its breaking out party? That was the question for mRNA. Before that, I wrote a piece about Florida and its COVID experience and how the right seemed to want to hold up Florida as like this absolute champion of the pandemic, and the left wanted to demonize Florida and say that Ron DeSantis was killing people. And I thought like, I want to figure out what's going on in Florida. How can there be two competing narratives that are looking at the same data and coming to entirely different conclusions? And then before that, I did a piece on the housing market that was just like, I talked to a chief economist at Zillow. I love writing about housing markets because houses are and ownership is such a big part of our life and our economy. And there was just an obvious mystery. In places like San Jose, housing prices were up 20% and rents were down 20%. And that had never happened before in American history, to have like rent and ownership diverge in this way. And so I wanted to figure out why. So in many ways, I think my job at The Atlantic is to be a kind of roving detective. And whether the case takes me into economics or epidemiology or demographics, I only really want to write a story once I like sink my teeth into what makes it mysterious.
And now you churn out a lot of columns. You have one out pretty much every week. How long does it take to report out some of these pieces? Because some of them, I mean, like I'm like, wow, this guy can work fast. Like, you know what I mean? Doing this in a week. I mean, is it pretty much like a week's worth of reporting, or do you have like ongoing, kind of overlap? How does that work?
Yeah, it totally depends. I'm lucky to work at a place that is willing to accept like the amuse-bouche style story, the appetizer story, the entree story, the full meal. Like if I want to write something that's 600, 700 words long that has like a clear point, sure, they'll publish it. If it's 1,500, 2,000, 10,000, there's space for it. Most of my essays are around 2,000. The kind of mysteries that I'm interested in, I feel like satisfyingly answering them, at least to my satisfaction, takes about 2,000 words. So I tend to write, or I guess I tend to publish, that about 2,000 words a week. And I often find that my work is happening on parallel tracks. I'll be writing one piece while sending out emails for another piece, while wasting time on Twitter that in retrospect I'll justify by saying, oh, but I discovered a new story idea.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I guess it's hard to say how much time I'm spending reporting versus writing each week, because it's all sort of happening at once. But aiming for about one to two great columns per week is my goal.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And now, I was just reading your housing market story recently, and I was like, whoa, like, because we've all heard about the hot real estate market, but I haven't heard much about rents going down. And I mean, the whole piece was really interesting. I was wondering, how did you find that story idea? Was it just like kind of anecdotal, talking to friends, or like, I don't know?
Yeah, so it definitely emerged out of conversations with friends. I have friends who are trying to buy houses in Los Angeles, Chicago, and they've just said it's a nightmare. So that was in the back of my mind. But I've also been writing a lot about some of the societal implications of the pandemic. And one of those implications is, well, where are people going to live? Are they going to leave cities faster than they used to? Are they going to move to cities slower than they used to? Will they be more likely to live in exurbs and suburbs and essentially do Zoom to work rather than drive to work? So in the process of thinking through all those implications, I talked to a bunch of housing economists. What's hot in the country and what's not. And for the purpose of reporting out that piece, I actually ended up discovering there was like all these weirdnesses happening in the housing market that hadn't been satisfyingly answered. So I, for example, was struck by the fact that if you look at sort of most large urban markets, downtown rents are plummeting, but suburban home ownership and suburban housing prices are rising. So you have a lot of people leaving the downtown cores and moving out to the suburbs. But you have, as I said earlier, just some really, really strange occurrences, like places like San Jose, Washington, D.C., even New York, where housing is doing really, really well. And meanwhile, if you're a landowner for rents, like your business is falling apart. And so I just felt like that was a fascinating thing to dig up. Why are we seeing the largest ownership rent divergence in prices in American history? And that led me to this piece.
Yeah, no, it was a great piece. It really was. One of the things that I've been like looking forward to talking to you about is the podcast that you created, which, I was like looking for a great podcast to listen to. And I got to say, yours is one of the best I found. And
Thank you.
And can you just talk a little bit about, obviously you're a writer for The Atlantic, going into, it's almost like a whole different business, like podcasting, how it came about. Did you have to really fight for this, pitching it to editors? Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, The Atlantic is pretty good about allowing people to try new stuff. So we had just hired a podcast head, Catherine Wells, who's absolutely brilliant. And as she was hired, they asked me, I'd been talking about wanting to do a podcast, and they asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, one thing that I would love to do is a podcast that answers big questions in tech and science. I feel like there's all these really complicated questions that people ask about the future of self-driving cars, or whether or not we should break up Amazon, or how we should think about Facebook and the truth, or the role of sexism and racism in the technology industry. Just so many big topics here. And I knew how to write about these issues on the page, but I was itchy to learn more about how to dig into those kind of questions in a podcast. So I learned a lot very, very quickly. I started from zero, and Catherine really, really helped me learn a lot. There's a couple of things I think are definitely true about podcasts. You're moving from sort of a writer's life to a podcaster's life. One is that like the premium for clarity goes up. It's so important in any article to write clearly, but in a podcast, you need to be even more clear about your ideas. Like it's very difficult to write in florid language as you're animating, or excuse me, as you're narrating a description, as I did in my podcast, about where aliens might be if they exist in the universe. Like no one wants to hear like poetry and like weird complicated semicolon sentences there. Like they just want like, how do I think about aliens? And so it really is I think a fun focusing mechanism for arriving at simplicity. I think so much of good writing is about sort of condensing from complexity, understanding complexity, but expressing it in simple ways. And podcasts, I think, are a great medium for that. But overall, I really love my podcast experience, and I'm hopeful that I get to do more.
Yeah, no, and how long did it take? I'm just curious, like to do, say, an episode. Would it take about as long, to write like a 2,000-word piece, or?
Absolutely not. So much longer. So
Longer?
much longer.
Oh, damn.
Oh
okay.
my God. So yeah, so I probably, it's unbelievable how time consuming podcasting
Really?
is. If you're doing a produced show the way that we were doing. So we produced, 5 to 7 episodes in each season, and each season took about 5 months. So that's a month per piece rather than my sort of typical pace, which is about 4 days per piece.
Yeah.
So almost 10 times longer. Or I guess on work days, almost 5 times longer. And the reason is because with podcasting, the way that we did it, you have to pick a topic, you have to find the experts, it's all in their voice, and then you have to interview them, you have to edit the interviews, you have to splice in your narration between the interviews. There's just so much to do. And I remember thinking, right as I was like getting my hands deep into the first season of the podcast, thinking that writing was a bit like painting or sketching. You start with a blank canvas and you are entirely in control of where the stylus or the paintbrush goes. But with podcasting, the way that we did it, which is Crazy Genius, is a very produced podcast. The way that we did it was so edited and entirely in other people's voices, mostly other people's voices, because we're editing other people's interview or my interviews with other people. It wasn't like painting, it was like marble sculpture, because the interviews come in and they're these blocks of marble and you have to chop at them just so that you can fit it into the podcast. And then you have to bring in this other piece of marble that you're wrapping into the former piece of marble, and then you chop that up. There's so much editing of raw transcript that happens in podcasting. Whereas I do lots of interviews and I have transcripts for my interviews, but messing with a transcript for an interview is so easy. Like they say the thing that you're interested in, you write it down, and you just copy paste it into your paragraph and you write around it. It's so much easier. So podcasting, the way that we did it was very hard, but I learned a lot in how hard it was.
Cool. And now, how big of a team did you have? Was it just you and a producer working on it, or?
So it was me. There was Catherine, the executive producer, and then we had other people that were helping out season by season that were coming in. So I'd say probably like full time about 3 people at a time working on the podcast, and sometimes we'd have other help, and we shipped out for sound editing and things like that.
Well, I gotta say again, it's a great podcast, and anybody who's tuning into this, it's called Crazy Genius, and I think it's available on all the main podcasting platforms.
Oh yeah,
I've seen it. So, but no, definitely worth checking out for sure. And another one of your big projects from your career so far is obviously your book. And I don't know if you could maybe tell a little bit about your book and how that came to be. Is that something that you pitched to agents on your own, or how did that come
yeah.
to be?
So the long story of the book, or at least I'll do it medium. Story of the book is when I was a macroeconomics writer, I was writing a lot about productivity divergences, which is a very boring way to say some things in the world are getting really, really expensive and some things in the world are getting really, really cheap. And I was interested in the difference, right? You sometimes see these graphs that go viral, like once every, at least in my world, like once every like 3 or 6 months, that shows like, oh my God, like the cost of healthcare and college education and textbooks is going way, way up. And then you have these blue lines going down, you know, television sets and, you know, clothing is going a little bit down. And I was just interested in the answer to that question, you know, why are productivity divergences happening the way they are? An editor at an imprint reached out to me to turn that into a book. And I said, you know, I am interested in the subject, but I don't think I want to write a book about this. And for the next few years, we sort of batted back and forth ideas for what would be an interesting book. And almost on a lark, I remember saying, you know, I'm really interested in why some products become hits and why products that seem the exact same don't become hits. That seems like a really weird, but also big question that goes very deeply to human psychology, the fundamental question of why do we like what we like? And that book became Hitmakers. And so I wrote that, published it in early 2017, and really had a blast writing the book. I mean, the book is basically a story of human psychology as told through episodes of hits in pop culture history. What does Star Wars tell us about why we like what we like? What do pop songs tell us about why we like what we like? What is it about the science of music that gives us earworms? You know, questions like this that were at the intersection of just sort of fun and important. I always like. So the writing process of that book was really a pure joy.
Oh, that's great. And now, if you don't mind, like, how long did it take? Did you have to take time off of work to do it, or how did it work into your work schedule at the Atlantic?
Yeah, so I took off 6 months at the Atlantic to do it, and I wrote, I'd say, 80% of the book in those 6 months, and sort of, you know, tinkered when I came back to the Atlantic. But yeah, I took 6 months off, and for me, I don't know how I would write a book without taking time off. It's you know, writing long. The longer I write, the more the work isn't like the production of words, but the organization of ideas. Dusting off a metaphor that I remember having used a while ago, so I might not get it right on the first retrieval, but it's like writing a blog post is like shopping for a shirt. It's like you look for the shirt and you're like, okay, boom, I found my shirt, right? Like that's like that's 700 words, that's a take. You're like, you just need that one unit, like that one graph, that one essentially idea, like that'll take you for 500 words. If you get to like 1,500 words, 2,000 words, 3,000 words, then it's not a shirt, it's a closet. You've got a bunch of ideas here, and it's about, all right, where do I put this? Like, are the sweaters here, or are they here? Are the shorts here, or are they here? And that organization process really comes into play as the piece goes from, say, 500, 600 words to 2,000 to 3,000. A book is like filling out a house.
Yeah.
There's so much space that you have to fill. And it's not just a matter of like filling it with stuff. No one, I think, maybe some virtuosos can just write through the book, you know? It's just like,
Yeah.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, blah, 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 and now, you know, Tale of Two Cities is over. Like you're inspired by an idea in chapter 1, and then you have an idea in chapter 7, and then you get a call about a interview that you can do for the guy that you had pegged for chapter 4, but you do the interview and you're like, this is much better for chapter 10. So the whole thing is happening on these parallel tracks, and it's such an organizational puzzle. And so there's a jigsaw puzzle quality to writing a book that is true for long pieces, but is just so much more true for a book because there's so much more space to fill with the jigsaw puzzles.
Yeah, 70,000 words or so can be a lot.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, it was about 80,000 words. So that's exactly
All right, nice.
It's a lot of words. Yeah.
Now, obviously, you've been at the Atlantic a long time, and you know the audience. SPJ serves a lot of journalists of all different ages. You know, from freelancers to staffers. We'll be watching this possibly on YouTube. You know, for a journalist who's like interested in maybe writing for the Atlantic or a magazine like the Atlantic, do you have any advice or anything to give?
Yeah, sure. You know, I think it's I want to give advice. I want to give advice that's like original, because I do think that like most of the advice that's given that's like kind of true is cliche. I think it's always an important challenge to keep trying to figure out new things. Like I see a lot of writers these days who don't seem as curious about the world. Like, they have an idea and they sort of stick with it. And that's a great way to thrive in an ancient world of beats, where it's like you're on this beat. Like, maybe like having those narrow interests like allows you to like just sort of stick with the beat. But the writers that I see that have the most success, I'm always surprised by what they're doing. I can't necessarily predict their next project. And my guess is that their unpredictability flows from the fact that they're allowing interestingness to guide them, rather than allow what they perceive market interest to be to guide them, or writing for their friends to guide them. And interestingness, can somewhat beg the question, I guess, like, what is interestingness? Well, I think interestingness is like, to me, is at the intersection of novelty and importance. What is important in the world, and what's something new you can say about it? And if you have both, if you have novelty and you have importance, you've probably got a pretty good story. And so seeking out that nexus of importance and novelty, I think is a good way to orient yourself in the world.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And also somebody posted a question while you were talking in the little chat area about how you got to the Atlantic. I know we talked about it briefly at the beginning, but I don't know if you can tell me a little bit more about, so did you just like pick the Atlantic out of a hat and apply? But can you tell us a little bit more of, how you got there in the first place?
Yeah, it was a total fluke. I was a senior at Northwestern, and I'd applied to like 30 internships in 2008, which was a terrible year to apply to internships in journalism. That was the middle of the Great Recession. And I applied to all these internships, and none of them write me back. And then I finally see like on some listserv or something, an application to an Atlantic Media Fellowship, which is not a writing fellowship, but like some other kind of fellowship. And I was like, oh, I might as well apply to this. And that was the job. So, I would say, to writers, especially young writers that are starting out, that if you're frustrated by not hearing back from, the first 10 places that you applied to, I was 100% in the boat, and I understand how unbelievably frustrating that is. And for better or worse, I think you really do have to sort of cast the widest of all possible nets, because you just never know, like, when someone is going to have the time to look at your resume, where a place might open up that has an opening that is shaped in exactly the shape of your interests. And so applying broadly for that reason, I think is just so important.
Yeah, and I got to say, if there's a particular publication that you want to write for too, like you said, be persistent. Don't, if you don't hear back, don't be frustrated. I tried when I applied for the Globe way back when, I literally hit up like every single editor I could imagine. And I sent them like my updated copies of my resume every single time I won an award. When I finally got called in for an interview, they were like, clunk, like, here's your file.
Right,
Thanks
right.
for keeping us like posted. Wow. Like, but yeah, just be persistent. And also, it helps if you can like meet, editors. And another piece of advice I always give too, is, if they're not interviewing for jobs at the time, you can always ask for an informational interview. And it's a great way if somebody can accept, just a little coffee over lunch, you know what I mean? It's a great way to like meet editors, kind of get your foot in the door if they have the time, you know what I mean? But,
Yeah, no, I think it's all very smart. I think all that is true. The fact with casting a wide net is probably pretty straightforwardly obvious to a lot of people. The other thing I guess I would say is that, the opportunities for independent writing feel a lot wider than they were when I was 22. I really was taught at journalism school that blogging was a dirty word. And so for that reason, like, was sort of afraid of the concept of writing directly into a CMS. But today with Medium and Substack and all these other things, there's so many ways to just build up a corpus of your own thinking. And, my sense is editors like having the confidence that new writers have published at established places. But there are definitely some times where we've given a shot or, approved an article by someone who had never really published anywhere, was a really, really young writer. And we just, we loved the pitch, or we loved their Twitter presence, or we loved a blog that they had written that had been shared internally on our Slack, things like that. So I don't want people to think that like the only way into the castle is just to like knock on 100 doors and just keep circling the castle, knocking. That is absolutely one way to do it. And so I'm not arguing against it, but it's not the only way. And another way that you can do it, I think, is cultivating a voice on your own in your own private world, whether that voice is on Twitter or on Medium, Substack. And then if you think you wrote something that's like pretty good, maybe like send that and send that to an editor and be like, I'd love to develop this. I'd love to expand on this in a piece for Slate, The Atlantic, whatever. And I do think it's really important because I get a lot of questions about people pitching The Atlantic. I'm shocked by how many people pitch The Atlantic and don't seem to understand it. They pitch us as if they're pitching Newsweek, Washington Post, New York Times, Boston Globe. There's no sense. It's not that all these places are the point is these places aren't the exact same. They have their own thing that they do, whether it's stylistic or in terms of genre and coverage area. And The Atlantic's thing, to oversimplify it for the purpose of optimizing memory, is like, we're an ideas magazine. And that means that an article that's like in the vein of what X news event says about Y idea tends to be pretty aerodynamic. So when people have an idea they want to pitch The Atlantic and they have an X, then I say, that's great. You've got your X. What you need to do is be able to show editors that you can expand on that X into the Y, right? What is this about? What idea does this connect to? What history does this draw on? What lesson moving forward or concept about American government, democracy, does this like touch on? And having that ability to write so that you're doing that in an organic way, right? Like not what this random thing says about this other random thing that I just drew together because I heard Derek on a podcast say that like, we should do what X says about Y style stuff. Like an organic relationship between the kernel of the news event and the big idea, that tends to succeed more than a lot of other templates for Atlantic pitches.
No, that's good to know. That's really good to know. Very good advice for sure. And I know, Derek, you got to go. And, I just want to wrap this up by saying thank you so much. This has been eye-opening, and it's great to talk to you in person or over Zoom.
Yeah, great to talk to you.
And I just want to thank SPJ New England. If you have a chance, if you can follow their Twitter feed, it's the @ SPJ_New England. Definitely give them some love on Twitter. And Derek Thompson, I want to thank you and everybody tuning in. If you can make sure you buy his book, Hitmakers, look up his columns on the Atlantic. They're great. And also check out his podcast, Crazy Genius. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.